Hello, and welcome back to Introduction to Children's Science Podcasting. Again, I'm your host, Lindsay Patterson. I am the CEO of Tumble Media, a children's educational audio company, and I'm also the creator, co-host, and producer of Tumble, a science podcast for kids. This is the third part of our four-part series. The first two parts are up now on YouTube, so you can go back and reference them. And we'll be referring back and building on what we learned in those past two sessions. So always good to kind of go and refresh your memory. And, just like podcasts, every time you listen, you hear something new. So this brings us to getting started on our third session. And let me share my screen now. All right. Okay, so I have chosen an extended construction metaphor for this webinar, which I wasn't planning to do originally, but here it is. We have built a foundation in the last two sessions, and now we're digging in. I know that goes back to the foundation, but what can you do? We're going to be talking about some of the technical skills for producing a science podcast for kids. And as I've mentioned in the past, this webinar is geared at science writers, so it's going to be building off science writing skills. So if you want to learn more about science writing, there's a ton of great resources out there, but I'm going to start sort of from the assumption that you know something about science writing and all the basics of how to make science content for a general audience. So what we're going to be talking about today is outlining your podcast, interviewing scientists for kids, which is a slightly different skill set from interviewing scientists for adults. And we're going to be talking about writing for the ear, for specifically the kid's ear. Okay, so let's get to digging in with the outline. Okay, so just like writing an article, you are going to need an outline for your science podcast to organize your thoughts and get an idea of where you're going to go. And if you're like me, you write an outline and you don't always follow that outline, but it really helps you kind of like bring things together. We've talked a bit about how to design your podcast and all the things that you might want to fit in there and differentiate your podcast, take your approach and do something different. So as you actually get down to the business of writing, some things might shift and change, but your outline is going to be a place to kind of go back and just kind of like slot in the things that you want to do from the beginning. It's just getting those first ideas down on paper. And back in the first session, Sandon Totten from Brains On had a really good analogy for this. He described putting furniture in the room, and that for a podcast, the furniture is always the same, but the people in the room change. And so the question of the outline is, how are you going to interior decorate your podcast? Okay, so first things first, obviously the introduction. Typically, it's formulaic. You can do, again, and I'll caveat with this, you can do anything you want to do, but this is just kind of to provide you with a starting point. When I started Tumble, the introductions were really all over the place. I think I was trying to do kind of like a casual cold open, like, oh, you just stopped by our podcast and we were chatting about this, but eventually landed on having just the first lines always be the same. I say, hi, I'm Lindsay, and Marshall says, and I'm Marshall, and welcome to Tumble, the show where we explore stories of science discovery. And so that provides like this kind of like comfort of the routine. And for me, it means that I never really have to truly stare down a blank page because I know what those lines are going to be, and it kind of jumpstarts the writing process. The other thing that the introduction does is it sets expectations for kids. First of all, for the individual episode, it kind of provides the hook of why are you going to be interested in this? What are we going to learn? Where are we going to go? But it also sets the tone. How do the hosts sound? Like, what's there? What is the sound of the podcast? That comes through from the introduction. And as you've probably experienced when you listen to a podcast, the first time that you listen to a podcast and it kind of like either, makes you want to hear more or it might turn you off, that setting the tone is going to help kids and their parents determine whether they want to keep listening, whether they want to commit to it, and eventually will it become a favorite. So my suggestion for this is just to listen to a ton of other podcasts, both kids and adults. Listen to how they set up expectations for what the show will be like. And also, there's a lot of podcasts that I hear that I get frustrated by their lack of setting expectations. And so that really helps make it clear to me why the introduction is so important and what should be there versus what is sometimes missing. Okay, so segments. This is kind of the real furniture selection part of your podcast. And I don't want to tell you or even really give too many examples of what segments can be because the more creative you are with your podcast, the better. This is where you really deliver on your design plan. Yes, I've gone from the construction to the interior decorating metaphor, but it's really the part that sets your show apart. And it's where your approach comes together, it's where the execution comes together, and where you convey the message that you want to convey to your audience. Other elements to consider are transitions. How do you move between different parts of the podcast? They can be musical, they can be vocal, saying like, oh, now that that's out of the way, we're going to get on to the speed quiz segment or whatever, like everybody's favorite part. Do it however you want to, but just be as creative as possible. And then ad breaks. These are totally optional, whether you've chosen to have ads in your show or not. But best practices for kids is to keep it short and keep it age appropriate. Whether you're speaking to adults or you're speaking to children, right now, you can listen to examples in kids' podcasts. A lot of podcasts speak to the parents like this is a message for grown-ups. So also figure out what you want the messaging to be, because especially for kids, differentiating your editorial content from the advertising content is very important. And the outro. Okay, so this is the jumping off point for the podcast. And as we've discussed before, children like to do things after they listen. So here's where you can suggest modes of further engagement, whether it's exploring on their own or bringing things back to the podcast. You can have the call to action. That's your, rate and review, or, like and subscribe, or if you want them to send art, you want them to, participate in other activities or live events that the podcast might have. And then your sign off. We have settled on join us next time for more stories of science discovery. So you let them know what's coming up. Okay, so here's how you can sort of arrange an activity around this. Just go ahead and create an outline for your pilot episode. And try drawing your outline in blocks. And I'm thinking like physical pieces of paper, because as we've mentioned before, length is a consideration as well when you're making those segments. They have to, correlate to how much is the kid going to listen, where are they going to listen. So it's handy to time things out, and you can sort of like build your blocks to correlate to the length of the show. And then you can split them up, you can cut them up and add to them as you actually go through and develop the show. And so again, like, keep the idea of experimentation. Things are going to change a lot as you actually get to writing. And then as you're actually producing the episode and hearing it and hearing what works and hearing how it moves and where it, gets energy, where it loses energy, you're working in a constant state of taking feedback and amending things. A pilot takes a lot longer than a regular episode, so don't worry if you feel like you're spending an inordinate amount of time creating your first episode. That's totally normal. Okay, so interviewing scientists for kids. So not every science podcast has scientists in them. Um, and, they all work different ways, but Tumble is really based around scientist interviews. And I've learned a lot through doing, I bet it's been around 200 interviews. We've had 150 episodes. It's probably been 200 interviews with scientists. And it's a very different beast than interviewing scientists for adults, because it sort of starts in a different place. So I went through and tried to imagine the stages of interviewing scientists for kids. And the first step is to find the right scientist. So if you're a science writer, you probably have lots of experience searching for a source based on their expertise, their credibility, increasingly on diversity. So those are great places to start. For audio, and especially for kids, you need to consider voice, and not just, what their voice sounds like. The diversity of accents that you can bring and express through the podcast is incredible, but it's how the scientist communicates themselves as a human. So, you know, you've got to humanize the scientists and make them relatable to children. And the most that they're going to do that for you, or the more they're going to do that for you, the better. So you've got to start by sort of choosing somebody who is willing to play along with the idea of talking to kids and is going to be willing to take feedback about how best to communicate to kids. If they have experience with educational outreach, if they've shown themselves to be excited about science education, if they've talked to other outlets for kids or talked about their interests from when they were kids, that is all good signs when you're looking to select the scientist. And then listening to them on other podcasts or videos is a great way to tell how they might come across on your podcast. Because I think that we have all heard scientists who speak in a monotone on a, high academic level. That's going to be really hard to translate to kids if they are not interested in kind of changing the way that they present the science to fit the audience. You really have to have somebody who's going to play along, because the tape isn't going to change. And you can have, as much excitement and energy to bring across through your voice as a host, or if you have a different host. But if you have a different level of energy, it's always going to feel like a mismatch. Okay, So say you've found the right scientist. Now they're very excited about talking to kids and they're like, oh, this is fantastic. But they might be a little bit nervous about being able to translate their complex academic research to a much younger audience. Um, and this happens over and over again when I speak to scientists for Tumbles. It's great to start by acknowledging your responsibility to guide them towards the right language. You know, you are really the person who's going to bring the scientist and the kid together. So there's a lot of great questions that you can ask at the beginning to remind them of the audience that they're speaking to and help them imagine that they are talking to a kid. Even better, if you are working with a kid, that kid is going to be, just their presence is going to be pushing them to speak on the right level. So you can ask, how would you describe what you do if you're talking to name your age range here? How would you describe this if you were in front of a classroom right now? So that kind of puts them in the mindset of being where they need to be speaking to your audience, even though they're not there. And then you can also use a trick of dialing their words back to them in more simple language, the language that you would want them to use. And so often they take the cue and they, restate what you said, or they put it in another format that is, has brought it down a level and puts it in their own words. So feel free to, try out your own analogies or metaphors that you think that you might use to them, and often they'll kind of pick that up and mirror it. Okay. And the third step is to look ahead to the writing and think about how you're going to express the scientist as a character in your story. So what I mean by that is like help them be a fully well-rounded human. Um, Obviously we talk a lot in science writing and science education about how, scientists shouldn't be seen as, geniuses up on a pedestal. Like we want to show that science is everywhere. So really making them seem like somebody that they could encounter in their own lives and who are doing things that are similar to things that they're doing or have done in the past is really relatable. So help them tell a story about themselves. Ask, "Ooh, how did you get interested in being a scientist? What keeps you excited and engaged in your work?" Get them to talk about their feelings. How did you feel when this happened? What surprised you? Like you're on the side of the kid trying to imagine what it would be like to be doing this experiment or having this adventure, get them to really like show that there was truly an experience behind what they were doing. And then, act as a proxy for the kids. So think about how a kid would react to what the scientist said. Be like, oh, that's so cool, or like, oh, that's so surprising. And ask a question that kids might ask themselves, or sort of step ahead. Like, if they're talking about something that kids might have a misconception about or a comparison that they might make, go ahead and state that to the scientist and ask how they might respond to that idea so that, if there's sort of a logical connection that you have to make between kids' knowledge or what kids think they know and what the scientist is saying, you kind of have it in their own words. So obviously, this all goes towards writing for the kid's ear. So let's say you've got your outline, you've got your content all ready to slot in, you're ready to put pen to paper or, cursor to Google Doc. How do you write a script that is going to work for kids' ears? And yes, I recommend having a script. It's very difficult to improv an entire children's science podcast. Um, with Tumble, a lot of what we do is improv, just in terms of the play between hosts, but we always have a script that we come back to because you've got to know where you're going and you've got to write it as it's going to sound. So, in a science article, you might write a long sentence with some complicated clauses, and in the podcast, you've got to write for natural speech, or it's gonna be easy for kids to kind of get lost in terms of phrases that work a lot better on paper than they do for the ear. So basically, you're walking a tightrope with no safety net when you're writing a script for audio. Um, there's no images to capture the attention if the audio isn't working on its own. But on the other hand, you have the opportunity to really create an immersive world that just pulls kids in and won't let them go in just like this very imaginative way that really activates um, their imaginations and also allows them to learn so much more than they realize that they're learning. So here's a few general rules of thumb. Keep your sentences very short. This is something Sandon also mentioned and is just so very true. It is going to be better the shorter your sentences are because it just means that your speech is going to be more natural and you will be communicating ideas in a much more direct way. I like to use the idea of just if you have a sentence that goes longer than one run across the page, it's too long and you need to cut it up. The other thing that goes along with cutting it up is breaking it up. So if you're looking at your total script on the page and it's just like blocks of text, blocks of text, blocks of text, um, that is probably not going to be engaging for the ear. So you have a bunch of tools that you can use. How many different voices do you have on the show? What kinds of, sound cues and sound effects are you using? Variety catches the ear in a way that for kids, long chunks of tape or like back and forth with not much variety from the hosts really don't. So just like look at the chunks and just like cut them up like ice flows. And then keep it moving. Pacing is really key because often we'll have to edit the script by ear because where it looked like it was going to be fine on paper, it just sounds like it drags and it just didn't seem like it was going to be in the way that way in the script, but it does just kind of lose you when you're listening and you will learn a lot from figuring out how it lost you. But if you have parts that really have to be in there and they do feel like they drag just a little bit, you can put some music and sound design in there. And I like to think of like it putting the content onto a moving walkway. It's just like if you have a little bit of energy coming in through the music or a little bit of like different interest that catches the ear in a new way, like it's going to smooth over some of the parts of your script that aren't as interesting as the others. And bottom line, edit by ear. You will learn a lot from just hearing yourself and hearing what you've made. So there is a lot to learn. Again, those are just some basic rules of thumb. When you develop your podcast, you're going to find your own rules and you're going to find what works for you. You're going to find like, well, maybe, we didn't have to break it up as much as Lindsay said. So it's just a process and I want to keep this is open as possible for the, amazing diversity of creativity that you're going to bring to your own podcast. Okay, so we've got a great guest coming up, and before I introduce him, I want to tee it up a little bit by talking about podcasts in STEM education. So, obviously, science podcasts are inherently educational, and I think that it's such a unique opportunity for a podcast to be able to explore the environment of the classroom. I made podcasts sound like they're little explorers with backpacks, but I think you know what I mean. It's just a different place that adult science podcasts don't always get to go, and it's a different opportunity and a different way to think about how your podcast is being used and how it's being listened to. So early on with Tumble, we started getting emails from teachers who were using Tumble in their classrooms in very creative ways. They were building lessons off of the episode. They were having their kids sit down and listen to the episode while sketch noting or just playing it during transition or choice times, either for the entire classroom or for individual students. And we found that they were making a lot of interesting connections that we never would have dreamed of. And our experience is not unique. Many children's podcasters have had similar feedback, not just in science, because I personally believe that podcasts inherently have a place in the classroom because there's so many benefits of listening that have been well researched. But my dream, especially for science podcasts, is that teachers will learn to use them like they learned how to use science content from YouTube. It was a process of figuring out where's the content you can trust, how do you slot it in, and most teachers are still uncertain of how to use podcasts in the classroom, and podcasters are recognizing this opportunity, but still trying to figure out how to best create, adapt, or supplement their podcasts for the classroom. Um, and I've talked before about what we do know about podcasts in the classroom. You know, children like to learn new things through podcasts. Children are hearing podcasts in schools, and there's extremely high engagement with science content through the podcast medium. So now we are actually looking at how to use podcasts in the classroom in a way that's going to provide a guide for teachers to know what the best practices are and know how to both listen to and create science podcasts, thanks to a National Science Foundation grant with our partners at AUI, Oregon State STEM Research Center, and a group called Independent Science. So that's where our guest Peter Walters comes in. He works with Independent Science, and in the interview, he'll tell you more about the project, along with some learnings from his experience about coming on as an editorial consultant for the episodes that we're creating from the grants. And he's got an amazing perspective as a scientist and as an accessibility expert.
Lindsay?
Can you just start out by telling me a bit about your background and how you got into being a part of a science podcast for kids, as if I already didn't know?
Absolutely. My background is I am a physicist and a data scientist. I have a PhD in high energy nuclear physics from the University of Rochester, and I've just recently earned a master's in applied math and data analytics from Manhattan College. I also happen to be blind, and as part of that, I work at a company called Independent Science, where I am a science accessibility consultant. At Independent Science, we work to make STEM experiences accessible to blind and visually impaired students. So with that, we were managed to get involved in a grant with Tumble Science Podcast for Kids, in which we are sort of science accessibility consultants as part of the grant. We do a few other things as well, but that I think is one of our main roles here. Was part of this grant, and as part of that, then I am both co-PI, which is principal investigator for independent science, so sort of a team leader for the independent science part of the grant work. But I also am involved as an editorial consultant on the Tumble uh, podcast team for those episodes of the grant that or episodes of the podcast that are grant related.
Yeah. And so you come into all of our editorial meetings on those episodes. And typically, or like throughout the history of Tumble, it's just been me and my editor, Sarah. And it has felt so amazing to have you as part of the team. You really slotted in just as someone who's bringing a different perspective and also just a really fun person to have
Well,
in the
thank you.
conversation. um, so maybe we can describe together a little bit about the grant itself. What are the goals of the grant, and what are the episodes like that we're doing together?
Sure. So as I see it, the grant has uh two big pieces to it. One is just a general using uh STEM podcasts to enhance STEM teaching in the classroom. And this can be both on a listening side of things. So a teacher who wants to use an existing STEM podcast in the classroom to as part of the curriculum, and that can be that can take a number of different forms. There's a huge range of possibilities there, and one of the goals of the grant is to explore some of those options for teachers and how they like to use podcasts in the classroom. The other track there would be creation of podcasts in the classroom, um, which I think is also very fascinating in that, as is often said, and I think this is very true, if you want to learn something, one of the best ways to try and learn it better is to teach it. And so having students feel involved in the learning process by creating podcasts for their classmates or other students or whomever, I think can be an exciting way to bring science into the classroom. The other piece of it is to bring in podcasts that are inclusive, and in particular with this grant, it's focusing on blind and low vision scientists. So having, in this case, Tumble is creating podcasts, three per episodes per year that feature blind or low vision scientists. Um, and the goal here is to show that science, STEM is inclusive and accessible, but also to see if we can use this to shift attitudes uh, amongst teachers and students about the accessibility and inclusivity of STEM and the ability of blind and low vision people to make a contribution to STEM in a significant way.
Yeah.
And that this is something that students will hopefully be able to see themselves in, if they're so interested.
Yeah, there's so many facets to the project, and there's also a lot of facets to your involvement with it. Beyond being our editorial consultant, you're also helping work on an accessible web portal to get all of those
Yes.
materials in an accessible way at the end of the project, where any teacher can download it and it's going to be accessible to both blind and sighted students. As well as just a thousand other things that you do and working with teachers to focus group, all this stuff. But I do want to get to the questions that our attendees for this course have set up for
Yes.
you. But just to, I guess one of the first questions, and it kind of goes along with why are we doing this grant together? What are the advantages of podcasts as a medium for a science dissemination tool? I think especially in the classroom.
I think, oh gosh, I think podcasts have a lot of advantages just in general. So just taking a step and saying outside the classroom, as a medium, and I won't say necessarily format because there's lots of different formats that a podcast can take, but um, I think it's great in that they are very portable. They can, because you have uh, likely a device on you most of the time, you don't need to take anything else to listen to it. Um, it's something that you can listen to while multitasking, washing dishes, cleaning, exercising. You don't have to devote your entire attention to it. There's a lot of different formats that, for classroom use, means that a teacher has many different, I guess, many different choices for how they want to use a podcast in the classroom. On a listening side of things, do you want to find a podcast that you send the kids home, say, listen to this, and then come back and we'll discuss it tomorrow? Do you want to have one that can be broken up into small pieces, and so you listen for 2 or 3 minutes and then discuss in the classroom? Maybe there's one that talks you through an experiment that you pause every 30 seconds, let everyone catch up on the next step, and then do the next, then play it again, and then just make it through that way. Um, and the format also, I think, has a lot to recommend it in that when you're forced to rely on audio, you are going to approach explaining scientific concepts in a different way than you would if you had you were at the front of a classroom with a whiteboard, or if you were drawing a diagram for a textbook. Again, with the formats, it can be a single person talking, it can be a dialogue, it can be, especially with the dialogue back and forth, the person on the podcast can be the asking questions of the scientists and exploring in a way that they're acting as a proxy for the listener. Um, uh, and those are just off the top of my head. Those are just several of the ways I think podcasts can be really useful. That, and you're going to, so to finish my thought, you're going to explain things differently when you can't wave your hands and make gestures or draw on the board. And sometimes that different approach can lead to a different understanding of the material.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think what you mentioned are also like a lot of good design tips when people are thinking about designing their podcast for the classroom, of how teachers might potentially use it, and sort of the things that they would want to hear within the podcast that make it more usable in education settings. And I also, like, one of the things when we started formulating the idea for the grant is just how, and you mentioned um, having to rely on audio and, you know, dispersing with the visual cues that often teachers rely upon for teaching
Right.
science. How do you think, in particular, podcasts are, powerful for blind students?
The general rule for accessibility is if you can design things that are accessible and inclusive from the start, you get a much better product. And uh, generally everyone benefits from that. Not just those populations you're trying to include or make accessible for. Um, so this is one of the ideas behind something called universal design learning, or universal design for
For
learning.
learning. I just
For
Googled
learning.
it.
Okay. So This is, and it's a big thing there, but it's also, as I said, you're gonna describe things differently than if you could just point to it, and that might, it. One of the funny things is sometimes for different people, different modes of learning are better. So the more the better. So if you've got a classroom and you're learning about this dinosaur fossil, and then you can then get a 3D printout of that fossil that you can hand around. So now you've got two modes of learning that are totally accessible. You've got the audio description from the podcast, and then you've got a tactile uh, piece of uh, teaching materials that you can pass around and feel along as they're describing on the podcast the different pieces of the femur. So um, I think there's just so much there that can be beneficial. And just because you can see doesn't mean that you're not going to benefit from an audio description. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say, like, the other side of it is representing scientists with disabilities in podcasts. A lot of the challenge sometimes in not having that visual is not being able to, see the faces, see the differences between scientists. And in terms of like, if you put something on TV, like you can see that their skin is a different color or they're in a wheelchair or something like that. So one of the challenges that we talk about in our conversations with these episodes is how do we represent blind scientists in ways that feel accurate, that feel authentic to their identities and how they want to be represented. What would you
right.
say are some of the main lessons of that?
I would say it really, I think one of the first things is try and honor whatever is their their preference for how they want to have their disability represented, their blindness. Some people are, this is a big deal for them and it's part of their public persona. Some people just say, you know what, I'm a scientist. Yes, I happen to be blind. That doesn't really come into it at all. Um, it's and trying to go with that. Let them describe in their own words, I think is the way we've this sort of policy we've ended up at with these episodes is follow their lead, let them describe in their own words. Um, I think one of the things that we do try and highlight as part of the because it's part of the grant is that they are blind scientists, um, but the degree to which that plays a part in the overall story of the episode can vary quite a bit. And I think one of the things is be flexible and just go with what makes sense and for both the story and for what the scientist in question is comfortable with.
Yeah. And I would say, one of the what would you say is like the baseline in creating a story around that scientist? Um, how sh how should you think about like representing their disability in the story itself?
It's I would always when we do this for the Tumble episodes, my first pass is always to say, let's get the science in there. And then for some people, their disability is really intertwined with how they do the science. And so it naturally falls in for some people. It just is well, yeah, I use Braille or my computer talks to me, but other than that, yeah, there's not much to it. And then that can be a little um I think the trick then is to say, all right, how do we want to fit this in? Because both for the grant, it's important that we fit it in, but a lot of times then it comes into questions of, well, how did this impact your maybe decision to become a scientist? There's such a wide range of variation in people, and how it matters. So, for instance, the we did one episode with Trevor Attenberg, who is a blind birder and environmental scientist, and for him, his stories of growing up and listening to birds and learning the bird songs were so much part of him not being able to see. um, it's very easy to fit that in. That was very much intertwined with it. Um, Sort of episode, when we spoke to Amy Bauer, Dr. Amy Bauer from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Um, she uses tools to make her work accessible to her, particularly with sonification, to make the data so she can listen to the data. Um, but she had a very different story. So in those two cases, just sort of the disability, the blindness came into the story in very different ways. One was in sort of a background and motivation, and for Trevor's case, and for Amy, it was this is how I do this, but it didn't quite have the same level of trying to think of
Like
what I'd say.
potency or influence.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of it is, I would say, if there's one thing that I would say, it's try not to shoehorn in the disability discussion. I think in all the cases, it's kind of naturally fit in somewhere and to a greater or lesser extent. Uh, but I think we've managed not to make it awkward. I hope we managed not to make it awkward, how we fit it in, because it's always felt very natural in the discussions of the podcast, and in the episodes themselves, without feeling like it's overshadowed the science itself. And I think that's been really important, for me as a blind scientist. I'm definitely in the I'm definitely on the side of people who are blind, that if you ask me for a list of descriptors about myself, I don't even know if blind would make it in the top 10. It's just
Mhm.
not something I think about, oddly enough. And so, um, the science is just, I feel like the science is really important, but also not hiding the fact that these are people who are blind who are also doing science, and I think that's also very important.
Yeah. It's really on a case by case basis of respecting each person's identity and how they see that as part of their science, how they see their
Right,
disability as part of their science identity. And I think that many of the lessons that we've learned through this can be applied to other marginalized backgrounds and how it may or
right,
may not come into the science. And so for audio, that's always a delicate balance because you can, often we have a conversation of like, should we remind people that uh,
right,
like the blindness is part of this, and ultimately, you really have to take the clues from the person, the cues from the person as
right.
to how much they want their disability to be part of the science. So, would you have any pieces of advice for people who are entering science podcasts for kids? This is going to be, or the group that we're addressing is primarily science writers.
Okay.
So, what would advice would you give them in terms of making a great and inclusive science podcast for kids?
So let's see. That's One is the one we've just talked about is keep your audience firmly in mind. And that doesn't necessarily mean really dumb things down, but you know, being willing to gloss over some things that as an adult and as a scientist, there's a joke about if you really want to drive a scientist nuts, ask them for a short, unqualified answer. And I feel like sometimes I get caught up in that. I go, oh wait, but what about that? Like, you know what? That's not important for the story.
I
I
learn a
think
lot though.
they learn, yeah, and it's like I easily get caught up in the details, and the details aren't always the important thing. The story is as important, especially for I think a children's podcast. Now you may have a choose to have a different format, and I think there are probably many different formats that could work. But I would say for a kids podcast, the having a light and fun motif is probably a good way to go, just to keep the kids engaged. One piece of feedback we do hear from teachers is having a podcast where there are within an episode um, vignettes that can be excerpted, so that you could, in a classroom setting, um, stop after 3 minutes and say, okay, let's take this piece, and it functions somewhat independently of the rest of the episode. Things like that in mind. I guess those are keeping use cases in mind with your audience in mind as well. Uh, for the inclusivity part, we've talked a bit about that. Certainly for blind and low vision students, it's easy to record podcasts using something like Zoom. Um, but I think one of the things is if you keep the fact that it should be audio only in mind, so that you're not gesturing, you're not pointing to things. Be aware of using words like this and that, referring back to other things, because those are often indications that you're pointing to things again. And it's a tough habit to get away from. Um, in terms of other disabilities, for hard of hearing audiences, having transcripts, and those can often be generated automatically with and then hopefully just a little bit of editing to make sure that it didn't garble things, is a nice thing to have along. Um, trying not to try not to speak over the kids' heads, I guess, is probably another thing. If you are familiar with making content for children, that's probably going to be easier because you're already in that practice.
Yeah, those are really fantastic tips. And I wanted to highlight too, podcasts for people who are hard of hearing, that transcripts are kind of the standard now, that there should be an expectation of having a transcript that's accessible with every podcast. So we put ours on our website. It can be anywhere. You can post it in the notes or anything like that. But there's a lot of ways to make things accessible for different audiences.
I would say too for blind and low vision audiences, if you do have a website, um, if you've got pictures, having alt text, it's a built-in tag that you can add manually, or I think some websites can even partly generate it, although I'd check that. Alt text is if you're using a screen reader, that's what is read in place of the graphic. So it'll say graphic, and then it will read out whatever that alt text is, and just to describe what the picture is of. That's really useful to have. Um,
Yes, thanks for mentioning that. That's a big part of it as well. to make your entire web presence be accessible. Uh, well, thank you so much for coming on to this course and sharing, what you've learned and the tips for inclusivity and accessibility. And it's been so wonderful to work with you. I wish you could be on every single episode because your perspective really brings so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for
Awesome.
having me. It's been fun.
Cool. All right. Okay. Well, I hope you guys could tell that Peter is an absolute gem of a human and he is an awesome person to work with. He brought up so many good points about how everybody benefits from a podcast that is designed from the start to be inclusive. Universal design for learning is something that is really great to look into if you're especially looking into designing a podcast for the classroom. And we talked a lot about the specific experience of making Tumble and representing scientists through our format and the way we tell stories, but I think that there are also lessons to take away from how to represent, whether it's fictional or non-fictional people and characters who are on your show through audio, and just kind of integrating their disabilities or their backgrounds in ways that feel organic and authentic to the podcast and to the stories that you're telling, as well as Peter gave a lot of actionable advice on how to design from the classroom based on what we've learned so far. So that brings us back to our final section of the podcast. No, we're not on a podcast. We're on a webinar. You get into one mode of your medium and you just stick with that language. But so this is the mindset question for the end of every session of the webinar. And this week, it's examining your own excitement. What have you heard about that you're most excited to experiment when it comes to science podcasts for kids? And I really recommend going towards that interest. Go towards what you want to try out and you're willing to learn and sort of roll with the punches, because that's going to keep you excited about starting, and it's going to keep your interest as you continue to develop the podcast. All right, so that's that for this week. And next week, we're going to have our final session and we're going to do a different format. We are going to bring the other members of the Tumble team on for a kind of ask us anything about how it works to have a company that's built around a science podcast for kids. So that's going to feature Sarah Robertson Lentz. She is our COO, as well as the editor that I've talked about many, many times throughout this course. And Marshall Escamilla, who is currently co-hosting and doing the technical direction for this webinar. He is our Chief Financial Officer, as well as the sound designer, music maker, and education specialist for Tumble. So as I mentioned before, think about all of your questions, your burning questions that, if you've had them throughout the course and they haven't been answered, come to this next week and you'll have the chance to put those questions to us directly and we'll be able to discuss them, as well as kind of giving an overview of, how to sustain a science podcast for kids. So thank you all so much for coming this week, and we'll look forward to our final session next week. Okay, great. So as I mentioned, please come, and it's going to be a great opportunity to, get some discussion going, which, we haven't done so far in the course, but I really want to have a good level of interaction and just be able to talk through the things that you're most curious to learn. So with that, we'll say goodbye. And again, my email is lindsay@tumblepodcast.com, and just reach out to me there with any questions that you want to throw at us for next week. The more that we can prepare the things that you're curious about learning, the better information we're going to be able to give you. All right, thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.